The morning my son-in-law slid a piece of paper across the breakfast table and told me to sign it, I didn't say a word. I just picked up my coffee, took a long, slow sip, and looked out the window at the oak tree I planted the year my daughter was born. It was still there, 34 years later, roots going deeper than anyone could see. He cleared his throat. We've been talking about this for a while now, Russell. The business needs a cleaner ownership structure, for tax purposes. I nodded slowly, the way I used to when my foreman at the shop would tell me something I already knew wasn't true. The paper was a transfer of interest document. My signature on that line would have handed over my 51% stake in Ashby & Sons Hardware, the store my father built in 1971, the one I'd run for 32 years, the one I had quietly, carefully rebuilt from near bankruptcy after the 2008 crash, to a holding LLC that my son-in-law, Trent, had formed 3 months earlier. I know that because I had already called my accountant, who had already found it. I didn't sign. I said I needed my reading glasses and went to the garage. And I stood there for a long time between the shelves of old paint cans and the workbench my father left me, and I breathed. This is where I should tell you how we got here, because it didn't start with that piece of paper. It never starts where it looks like it starts. My daughter Melissa was the kind of child who made you feel like you'd done something right. Smart, funny, a little stubborn, the way her mother was stubborn. Which meant she was usually right, and she knew it. When her mother passed from ovarian cancer 6 years ago, it was just the two of us for a while. We ate dinner together on Sundays. I taught her how to do her taxes. She called me when her car made a noise she didn't recognize. It was quiet, but it was good. Then she met Trent. I tried. I want to be honest about that. I tried to like him the way you try to like a song that everyone around you seems to love. He was handsome, good at small talk, wore the kind of shoes that cost more than my first car payment. He sold commercial real estate, and he talked about money the way some people talk about oxygen, like the conversation could simply not happen without it. Every Sunday dinner became a performance review of his latest deal. Every mention of the hardware store became an opportunity for him to explain how I could be doing things differently. I let it go, because Melissa was happy. And when your daughter is happy after losing her mother, you let things go. They got married in the spring of 2019. Outdoor ceremony, 200 people, open bar. I paid for most of it and didn't say so. 3 months after the wedding, Trent lost a major commercial listing, something about a lawsuit with a development company, and suddenly the topic of my retirement came up at every family dinner. You're 63, Russell. The body doesn't care how much you love that store. You've been running that place since before I was born. Don't you want to travel? Rest? Melissa and I could manage things for a while, just to take some of the weight off. I heard what he was saying, what he was really saying. And I smiled, and I said I'd think about it, and I went home and called my lawyer, a quiet woman named Beverly. No, wait, I can't use that name. Her name was Gwen, a quiet woman named Gwen, who had handled my father's estate and my wife's medical directives, and who had seen enough family situations to read them the way a doctor reads an X-ray. What are they actually after? She asked. The store. Maybe the building too. I own the property outright. She was quiet for a moment. How much is it worth? Appraised at 1.2 last year. The real estate market out here has been moving. Another pause. Russell, she said carefully, I want you to do a few things before our next meeting, and I want you to do them quietly. So I did. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. I wasn't a bitter old man looking for revenge. I was a father who had watched his daughter gradually become a stranger, who had watched her stop calling on Sundays, who had watched her nod and agree with a man who didn't respect anyone who couldn't help him get somewhere. I wasn't angry. I was sad. There's a difference, even if from the outside it looks the same. But I also wasn't going to hand over my father's store to a man who didn't know the difference between a finish nail and a framing nail. The thing about Trent was that he assumed I was simple. A lot of people do when you've spent your life behind a hardware counter in a mid-sized Ohio town. They see the work boots and the reading glasses and the flannel shirt, and they think they understand the whole person. Trent saw a 63-year-old man with no college degree, a modest house, and an old-fashioned business. And he thought the word he was looking for was easy. He was wrong about the degree, too. I took night classes for 11 years and finished my business administration coursework at 51. I never mentioned it to him because he never asked. Gwen walked me through the process over several weeks. First, we established something I'd actually set up years ago when my wife was sick, a revocable living trust with my name on it, into which the store property and business interest had been transferred. The LLC Trent had formed had no claim on anything inside that trust. He hadn't done enough homework to know the trust existed, because he'd only looked at the surface-level business registration, not the deeper property and asset filings. Second, we updated the trust terms. My wife had been the co-trustee. After she passed, I'd been meaning to name a successor trustee and hadn't gotten around to it. I named my nephew Owen instead. My sister's son, a steady 38-year-old CPA in Columbus who I trusted completely and who had never once asked me for anything. Third, and this was Gwen's suggestion, not mine, we changed the business structure. Ashby & Sons became a single-member LLC fully held within the trust. The old partnership structure that Trent had probably found on some state filing was dissolved and replaced. Clean, legal, invisible to someone who wasn't looking carefully. I signed the new documents on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Outside Gwen's office window, the maples were turning. I remember thinking my wife would have loved that drive home. The piece of paper Trent slid across the breakfast table a month later was, from a legal standpoint, a document asking me to transfer something I no longer personally own in the way he believed I did. He didn't know that, and I didn't tell him. I said I needed time to think about it. How much time? He asked. As much as it takes, I said, and I went to the garage. Now, I want to tell you what happened in between, because this is the part people don't see when they hear a story like this. The part that isn't satisfying or cinematic. It's the part where you have Sunday dinners and watch your daughter look at you across the table with something you can only describe as embarrassment, where you hear her on the phone with her husband in the next room saying, I know, I'm working on him. Where you bring over groceries for their house because you're still her father and you don't know how to stop being her father. And you leave the bags on the porch because she said they were going to be out, and you drive home alone and you sit in the kitchen where your wife's handwriting is still on the recipe cards in the drawer, and you wonder how things get to be the way they are. That's the real story. The legal maneuvering is almost beside the point. My son-in-law called me the first week of December. It had been 6 weeks since I'd left him with an unanswered document and a carefully neutral expression. We need to finalize things, Russell. His voice was the kind of careful that people use when they're hiding impatience. Melissa and I have some plans that depend on the structure being settled. Year-end, for tax purposes. I understand, I said. Why don't you both come to dinner Saturday? We'll talk it through. He paused, surprised at the easy agreement. Sure, yeah, we can do that. They came on Saturday. I made pot roast the way my wife used to make it, with the pearl onions and the red wine, and I set the table with the good dishes. Melissa looked around the house with the expression people wear when they're looking for something to criticize and finding it harder than expected. After dinner, Trent put the document back on the table. I looked at it for a long moment. I did a lot of thinking, I said, and I talked to Gwen. Something shifted in his face. He hadn't known about Gwen. I'm not going to sign this, I said, and I want to tell you why. He started to speak. I held up one hand, not dramatically, just the way you do when you need someone to wait. The store was my father's. He built it with $2,200 and a handshake loan from a man named Ed Kowalski, who sold farm equipment on Route 30. My father worked that counter for 41 years. I worked it with him, and then I worked it alone. And there were years in this family when that store was the only thing standing between us and a genuinely hard situation. It is not a tax structure. It is not a leverageable asset in a real estate portfolio. It is the place where I know every customer by name and where my father's picture is still on the wall by the register. I paused. I've restructured the trust. Owen is the successor trustee. The business is fully held inside the trust. What you've asked me to sign has no legal relevance to the actual ownership structure, which was changed 2 months ago. The silence in the dining room was the kind that has weight to it. Trent's jaw tightened. You can't just. I already did, I said. Gwen filed everything. It's done. Melissa was looking at her plate. She hadn't touched her food in the last 10 minutes. Mel, I said, and my voice came out softer than I intended. I'm still your father. That's not going to change. But I'm not going to hand over what my father built because someone drew up a document and called it tax planning. She didn't look up for a long moment. When she did, her eyes were wet, and I couldn't tell if it was anger or something else. Maybe she couldn't tell either. Trent pushed back his chair. This isn't over. I think it is, I said. I wasn't mean about it. I was just done. They left before dessert. I put the leftovers in containers and washed the good dishes by hand, and listened to the radio the way I do when the house gets too quiet. And then I sat in the chair my wife used to read in, and I allowed myself to feel every bit of the sadness that I had been keeping at a careful arm's length for the better part of a year. I cried a little. I want to be honest about that too. Not because I lost something, but because it had cost more than it should have. What happened next took about 3 months to fully develop, the way things do when they happen quietly. Trent, to his credit, was thorough. He hired his own attorney and had the trust documents reviewed. The findings were not what he had hoped. The restructuring was clean and properly filed, and there was nothing to contest. He made 2 more phone calls to me in January. One was still relatively civil, the second less so. I let the second one go to voicemail, and I've never listened to it. What I didn't expect was Owen. My nephew called me in February on a Sunday evening. He'd been reviewing the trust documents as trustee and had a few questions, which we worked through. Then he was quiet for a moment, in the way he is when he's thinking carefully about something. "Uncle Russell," he said, "can I ask you something honestly?" "Always." "Is the store doing okay? Not the trust, not the legal structure, the actual business." I told him the truth. The store had good years and harder years. We'd survived the Home Depot expansion in 2012 and the pandemic inventory chaos and 3 different recessions. Our numbers last year were steady. Not remarkable, but steady. "Because I have an idea," Owen said, "and I want you to hear me out before you say no." His idea was this. There was a regional hardware cooperative, a network of 12 independently owned stores across Ohio and western Pennsylvania, that had been looking for a new anchor member since one of their founding stores closed in Youngstown. Owen had been doing their tax work for 4 years. He knew them well. He thought Ashby & Sons would be a natural fit. "You keep full ownership," he said carefully. "This is just a purchasing and marketing cooperative. Better supplier pricing, shared advertising costs, maybe some staff training programs. You'd still run the store the way you run the store." I was quiet for a while. Outside my kitchen window, the February dark was complete, and the thermometer on the garage door read 22 degrees. "How long have you been thinking about this?" I asked. "Honestly, since you called me about the trust. I started doing some research. You've built something that's worth protecting, and I wanted to make sure you had more than just legal protection." My nephew, 38 years old, never asked me for a thing, spent his own unpaid time researching how to help me. I thought about Trent and his year-end tax purposes, and the contrast was quiet and clarifying. I said yes. "I want to tell you about the day we signed the cooperative agreement, because it was an ordinary Tuesday in March, and there was nothing dramatic about it. Owen drove up from Columbus, and we met at Gwen's office, and I signed the papers at her conference table. While outside the window, the first real thaw of the year was turning the parking lot to gray slush. Owen brought a thermos of decent coffee. Gwen made a comment about the weather. That was it. But on the drive home, when I passed the store and saw the lights on inside and my part-time assistant Donna moving around behind the counter and my father's sign above the door, Ashby & Sons Hardware, the lettering faded to a comfortable old gold, I felt something settle inside my chest that had been unsettled for a long time. My father built something real. I kept it real. And now it had more protection than it had ever had, and it was going to outlast whatever anyone tried to do to it. Melissa called me in April. I hadn't heard from her since December. She called on a Sunday, which is when she used to call before things went wrong, and when I saw her name on the phone, I sat down before I answered. She didn't lead with an apology. I don't think she fully knew how to. What she said was, "Dad, can we have dinner sometime? Just us." There was something in her voice that reminded me of when she was 9 years old and had broken a kitchen window playing ball and came to tell me before she'd figured out what excuse to use. Honest, in other words. Uncertain, but honest. Yes, I said. Sunday works, come at 6. I'll make something. What happened after that is still happening, which is the nature of real things. It doesn't end with a bow on it. She came to dinner. We didn't talk about Trent or the trust or any of it. We talked about her job, which she had apparently thrown herself back into. We talked about her mother. I showed her some photos I'd found while going through an old box in the closet. Her mother at 28, laughing at something off camera, standing in front of this same house. Melissa held the photo for a long time. She comes to dinner most Sundays now. Trent is not usually mentioned. I don't ask, and she doesn't explain, and somewhere in that quiet space, something is slowly, carefully being rebuilt. I'm 64 years old. I have a hardware store that my father built, and that I intend to be running when I'm 70. I have a nephew I trust with everything that matters. I have a lawyer who answers her phone. I have a daughter who is finding her way back, slowly, in the way that real things happen, slowly. And I have my father's store, and his picture on the wall by the register, and the oak tree in the yard, and 34 years of roots going deeper than anyone could see. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lash out. I picked up the pen, and I signed the right papers, and I let the wrong ones sit unsigned on the table, and I let the rest take care of itself. Some lessons cost more than they should, but they stay with you, and eventually, if you're patient enough, what you've built is still standing. And you are too. I keep thinking about my father's hands. He wasn't an educated man in the formal sense, but he understood something that took me 63 years to fully grasp, that what you build with integrity takes longer to destroy than anyone expects. He built that store with $2,200 and a handshake. Nobody could touch it because there was nothing dishonest in the foundation. That's what I kept coming back to in the months when things were at their worst. Not anger, not strategy. Just that image of my father behind the counter, knowing exactly what he built and why. I think about what it actually took to get through that year. Not the legal work, though, that mattered. What it took was something harder to name. It was the willingness to sit with the sadness of watching my daughter become someone I didn't fully recognize, and to not let that sadness turn into bitterness. To keep making pot roast. To keep the porch light on. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of steadiness there is. A lot of people would have blown up that dinner table the first time Trent slid a document across it. I understand the impulse. But blowing it up would have felt good for about 10 minutes and cost me my daughter for the rest of my life. It is a version of this story where I'm the victim and Trent is the villain, and it ends with some dramatic confrontation and everybody gets what they deserve in a clean and satisfying way. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and slower and more complicated. Trent was opportunistic and he was wrong, but my daughter was also a grown woman who made choices, and some of those choices hurt, holding both of those things at the same time. The wrongness of what they tried to do, and the love that doesn't switch off just because someone disappoints you, that's not comfortable. But it's honest. What protected me wasn't luck. I had spent decades reading carefully, asking questions, building relationships with people I trusted. Gwen, Owen, the staff at the store who'd been with me for years. When things went wrong, I had a foundation to stand on. That foundation was built choice by choice, year by year, long before anyone tried to take anything. You can't build it in a crisis. You can only use what you already built. And I think about Owen, my nephew, who drove up from Columbus on a Tuesday in March with a thermos of coffee and documents that changed the trajectory of the store. He didn't do it for anything. He did it because that's who he is. Those are the people you find when you've lived in a way that deserves them. Not the ones who show up when there's something to gain, but the ones who show up because they think it's the right thing to do. I'm 64 years old. I don't have a lot of patience left for the idea that doing things right is naive. I've seen what happens when you don't, and I've seen what happens when you do. The store is still there. My father's picture is still on the wall, and on Sunday evenings, my daughter comes to dinner. That's not nothing. That's everything.